Marcus Webb had perfected the art of being invisible, not literally, of course, because that would require some kind of fancy cloaking technology, and humans were still figuring out how to make toast without burning down their kitchens. No, Marcus had mastered the far more practical skill of sitting in the back corner of Zenith Galactic Academy's advanced xenobiology classroom, keeping his mouth shut and letting everyone else assume he was probably too stupid to contribute anything meaningful to the conversation. It was working beautifully. "Now then," Professor Krang announced, his tentacles writhing with barely contained excitement, "who can tell me the atmospheric composition of Kepler-42b?" 8 different appendages shot into the air. Marcus glanced around at his classmates and suppressed a snort. Vextar the Crystalline was practically vibrating with knowledge, her faceted body catching the light. Zip the techno-savant had already pulled up a holographic display showing molecular diagrams, and Thorn the Spike Beast was flexing his natural armor plating, in what Marcus had come to understand was the spiked equivalent of raising your hand politely. 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, with trace amounts of argon and carbon dioxide, Vextar chimed, in her crystal-clear voice. Professor Krang's eye stalk swiveled approvingly. "Correct. This brings us to today's announcement." The classroom fell silent. Even Bloopy the gelatin stopped jiggling, which was genuinely unsettling because Bloopy never stopped jiggling. "Your final examination will be a practical survival assessment. You will be transported to a randomly selected death world and required to survive for 48 standard hours using only basic equipment and your natural abilities." The silence stretched on. Marcus counted to 5 before the panic started. "A death world?" Bloopy squeaked, his gelatinous form quivering with terror. "Professor, surely you don't mean an actual death world?" Professor Krang's tentacles curled in what Marcus had learned was the Kragnerian equivalent of a grin. "I mean exactly what I said, Mr. Bloopy. A death world, class 9 or higher on the Galactic Habitability Index. The kind of planet where the very air tries to kill you, the wildlife considers you a light snack, and the weather patterns were clearly designed by something with a very twisted sense of humor." Vextar's crystalline structure began to dim slightly. "Professor, with respect, humans are known to be one of the more fragile species in the galaxy. Perhaps Mr. Webb should be excused from this examination, for his own safety?" Marcus tried very hard not to laugh. Humans, fragile? If only they knew. "That's very considerate of you, Miss Vextar," Professor Krang replied. "But the selection process is completely random. The odds of the transport landing on a world that poses any particular threat to human physiology are astronomically small." Marcus nodded seriously and tried to look appropriately terrified, while inside he wondered what his classmates would think if they knew what he was really good at. The landing. The transport ship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of their randomly selected death world, and Marcus had to bite his tongue to keep from grinning. Through the viewport, he could see the familiar rust-red landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, broken only by sparse scrub vegetation, and the occasional rocky outcropping. "Oh no," Bloopy whispered, his gelatinous form pressed against the viewing window. "It's like someone took a perfectly good planet and set it on fire." Vextar's crystalline structure was already beginning to show stress fractures, just from looking at the landscape. "The thermal readings are off the charts. This can't be within acceptable parameters for a survival examination." Zip's mechanical sensors were going haywire. "Surface temperature is reading 47 degrees Celsius in the shade. If there was any shade, which there isn't. The humidity is practically non-existent, and the UV radiation levels are borderline lethal for most carbon-based life forms." Professor Krang consulted his datapad with deliberate cheerfulness. "Ah yes, planet designation Earth, Terra, Sol 3, Class 9 Death World, notable for its extreme temperature variations, hostile wildlife, and remarkable ability to kill things in creative and unexpected ways. The locals call this particular region," he paused to check his notes, "the Australian Outback." Marcus nearly choked on his own spit. "The human homeworld?" Vextar turned to stare at him with something approaching horror. "Mr. Webb, you're from this nightmare hellscape?" "Well," Marcus said carefully, reaching up to start unfastening his environmental suit. "I'm actually from the North American continent, but yeah, same planet." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or a complete psychological breakdown. "You're taking off your protection suit," Bloopy observed, his voice rising to what could generously be called a squeak. "Marcus, buddy, pal, I don't think that's a good idea." Marcus shrugged out of the top half of his suit and immediately felt better as the recycled air stopped making him feel claustrophobic. "Toxic levels of oxygen?" Bloopy, that's just regular air. And 47 degrees? That's not even that hot. I mean, it's warm, sure, but it's a dry heat. Way more comfortable than Houston in August. He glanced around at his classmates' horrified expressions and realized he probably should have played up the concern a bit more. I mean, this is definitely going to be challenging for all of us. But it was too late. Zip's optical sensors had focused on him with laser-like intensity. Marcus, when you say this isn't that hot, exactly how hot does it get on your home world? Oh, you know, Marcus said casually, stepping completely out of his environmental suit. Depends where you are. Death Valley can hit 54 degrees on a good day. The Sahara's gotten up to 58. And that's just the places people actually live. The transport ship's landing gear engaged with a heavy thunk, and Marcus breathed in deeply through his nose, catching just the faintest hint of eucalyptus and sun-baked earth filtering through the ship's air recyclers. Home sweet home. Places people actually live, Vextar repeated faintly. Well, yeah, I mean, you adapt. Humans are pretty good at adapting. Marcus grabbed his basic survival pack and slung it over his shoulder. Besides, the outback's not that bad once you know what you're doing. Plenty of water if you know where to look, lots of edible plants, and most of the dangerous animals are pretty easy to avoid if you're not stupid about it. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss, and Marcus stepped out onto the red dirt of the Australian outback, breathing in the dry, familiar air and feeling the sun on his face for the first time in months. Behind him, he could hear Bloopy making what sounded like praying noises in gelatinous, Vextar muttering something about impossible thermal tolerances, and Zip running rapid calculations on human physiological limits. This was going to be fun. Day 1. Learning curve. Marcus had been on the surface for exactly 17 minutes when the first piece of alien technology gave up the ghost. Zip's environmental scanner made a sound like a dying robot chicken, and started smoking. This is a Class A scientific instrument, Zip muttered frantically. It survived the methane storms of Proxima 7. It cannot be defeated by simple thermal exposure. Marcus glanced over from where he was examining a clump of spinifex grass. It's the dust. Gets into everything out here. Electronics don't really like it. The scanner gave one final, defiant beep and went silent, forever. 20 meters away, Vextar was discovering her own problems with Earth's hospitality. Her crystalline structure was showing hairline cracks that spread visibly across her surface, as the temperature differential created thermal stress. This is highly irregular, she announced, though her voice had taken on a slightly brittle quality. My species evolved in the stable thermal environments of the crystalline nebula. We are not designed for these extreme temperature fluctuations. Temperature fluctuations? Marcus looked up at the sun, which hadn't moved noticeably since they'd landed. It's been pretty steady since we got here. Meanwhile, Bloopy was having what could charitably be described as an existential crisis. His gelatinous form had taken on a distinctly concerning shade of gray-green as the dry air began pulling moisture from his cellular matrix. I'm evaporating, he said in wonder. I'm literally evaporating. This is fascinating from a scientific perspective and absolutely terrifying from a staying alive perspective. Marcus pulled a water bottle from his pack and tossed it to the increasingly desiccated gelatin. Here, small sips. You'll want to conserve it. Bloopy caught the bottle and immediately began pouring it over himself with obvious relief. How did you know I needed? He stopped mid-sentence. Wait, conserve it? Marcus, how much water did they give us for this survival test? Marcus did a quick mental inventory. Standard Academy issue is 2 liters per person for the 48-hour period. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Zip's backup scanner joining its predecessor in electronic death. 2 liters, Vextar repeated slowly. For 48 hours, in a desert environment where the very air is trying to desiccate us. That's not going to be enough, Thorne spoke up for the first time since they'd landed. That's not going to be nearly enough. Marcus looked around at his increasingly panicked classmates and felt a familiar stirring of what his grandmother had always called his helpful nature. Actually, he said, shouldering his pack and scanning the horizon, 2 liters should be fine if we're smart about it. There's water out here, you just have to know where to look. He started walking toward a slight depression in the landscape, where the vegetation looked marginally greener. Behind him, he could hear his classmates scrambling to follow. Water? Bloopy's voice carried a note of desperate hope. Pretty sure, Marcus replied, dropping to one knee next to what looked like absolutely nothing to the untrained eye but which he recognized as a native fig tree. See this? The way the leaves are oriented? And the color of the soil underneath? There's water here. Not much, but enough. He pulled out his multi-tool and began digging in the sandy soil. 6 inches down, the sand began to darken. A foot down, it was distinctly damp. "How did you know that?" Zip asked, his remaining functional sensors focused intently on Marcus's excavation work. Marcus shrugged. "My dad taught me. His dad taught him. It's not exactly rocket science. Plants need water to survive. If there are plants, there's water somewhere nearby. You just have to know how to read the signs." By the time the sun had moved another hand's width across the sky, Marcus had managed to collect nearly a liter of muddy but drinkable water, built a basic solar still to purify it, and constructed a lean-to shelter, using nothing but fallen branches and basic knots. His classmates watched this display of primitive technology with the kind of fascination usually reserved for archaeological exhibitions. "It's remarkable," Professor Krang's voice crackled through their emergency communicators. "Mr. Webb appears to be employing indigenous survival techniques with considerable skill." Marcus paused in his fire-starting preparations. "Professor, are you monitoring us?" "Purely for academic purposes, I assure you. Please, continue as if I weren't here. I'm particularly interested in your combustion methodology." Marcus glanced at the pile of tinder and kindling he'd assembled, then at his classmates' expectant faces, then at the primitive bow drill he'd fashioned from a piece of hardwood and some fibrous plant material. "Right," he said. "Well, this might take a few minutes." It took 47 seconds. The tinder caught on his third stroke, and within minutes he had a proper fire crackling cheerfully in the gathering dusk. Loopy stared at the flames with something approaching religious awe. "Marcus, that was incredible. How did you make fire from nothing but sticks and determination?" "Friction," Marcus said simply. "Basic physics. Rub two things together long enough and fast enough they get hot. Get them hot enough, they ignite." As night fell and the temperature began its slide toward what the aliens would probably consider merely uncomfortable, Marcus settled in for what he expected to be a fairly routine camping trip. His classmates, huddled around the fire like refugees from a more civilized galaxy, were beginning to suspect that their quiet human colleague might be more than he appeared. Day 2, Revelations. Marcus woke up at dawn the way he always did when camping, which is to say gradually and without any dramatic fuss. His alien classmates, on the other hand, woke up the way most sentient beings do when they've spent the night convinced they were going to die in their sleep. "I can't feel my crystalline matrix," Vextar announced, her voice carrying pure panic. "The thermal differential has created microfractures throughout my entire structure." Marcus glanced over while stirring the coals back to life. "You look fine to me. The cracks are just surface stress. They'll heal once you warm up." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because you're still talking," Marcus said reasonably. "If the damage was serious, you'd probably be unconscious or dead." This was apparently not the reassurance Vexta had been hoping for. "Marcus, I don't suppose you know where we might find some breakfast?" Bloopy asked. "The Academy rations taste like recycled cardboard." "Funny you should mention that," Marcus said, standing up and brushing dust off his pants. "There's actually plenty to eat around here if you know what to look for." He wandered over to a cluster of prickly pear cactus and began examining the paddle-shaped segments like someone shopping for produce. "These are good," he said, carefully avoiding the spines as he cut away a section with his multi-tool. "High water content, decent nutrients. Tastes kind of like green beans if you cook them right." Zip looked up from his repair attempts with obvious skepticism. "Marcus, that plant is covered in defensive spines. How can it possibly be edible?" "Same way porcupines are edible," Marcus replied, methodically scraping the spines off with the back of his knife. "You just have to know how to prepare them." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when several highly intelligent beings simultaneously realize they may have drastically underestimated something important. "Marcus," Bloopy said carefully, "when you say porcupines are edible, you're speaking metaphorically, right?" Marcus looked up with genuine surprise. "Well, not regularly. They're more of a special occasion thing." He stopped, noticing their expressions. "You know what? Never mind. Let's focus on breakfast." He had just finished cleaning the cactus pads when Thorn suddenly went completely rigid. "Movement," he hissed, his spikes extending to their full defensive length. "Approaching from the northeast. Medium-sized predator, moving with purpose." The alien students immediately went into full crisis mode. Vextar's cracks began spreading again. Bloopy tried to make himself as small as possible. Zip's defensive systems began charging up with an ominous whining sound. "It's a carnivore," Thorn announced. "Canine family. Approximately 40 kilograms. Definitely hunting." Marcus squinted at the approaching animal and felt his shoulders relax. "Oh, that's just a dingo." "Just a dingo?" Vexter's voice rose to an impressive pitch. Marcus, that creature could easily weigh as much as you do. It has teeth. It has claws. The dingo, apparently attracted by curiosity, continued its casual approach. It paused about 20 meters away and sat down on its haunches, tilting its head in the universal canine expression of, "What exactly are you people doing?" Marcus looked at the dingo. The dingo looked back. A moment of perfect understanding passed between them. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus said conversationally. "Just passing through?" The dingo, possibly realizing that this particular group posed about as much threat as a cluster of nervous houseplants, yawned to show off an impressive set of teeth, and then lay down in the shade of a nearby bush to watch the entertainment. "Marcus," Bloopy whispered, "it's not leaving." "Or why would it leave?" Marcus asked, genuinely puzzled. "We're not bothering it, it's not bothering us. Dingoes are pretty chill as long as you don't try to pet them or steal their food." Pretty chill, Zip's optical sensors were locked onto the dingo with missile-like intensity. "That creature is a predator. We are potential prey." Marcus considered this while turning the cactus pads to cook evenly. "I mean, I guess technically we could be prey, but look at it. Does it look like it's hunting?" They looked. The dingo was now lying on its side, tongue lolling out slightly as it panted, watching them with the lazy interest of someone channel surfing. "Word. It looks..." Vextar paused. "It looks bored." "Exactly," Marcus said. "Predators don't usually hunt when they're bored. They hunt when they're hungry, or when they feel threatened, or when something runs away from them in a panic." As if to emphasize this point, the dingo yawned again, clearly displaying casual indifference rather than predatory intent. The meal was consumed in relative silence, with everyone trying very hard not to look directly at their canine observer. It was at this moment that Bloopy suddenly froze in terror. "Marcus," he whispered, "there's something on my food." Marcus glanced over and saw what had caused the panic. A huntsman spider had wandered onto Bloopy's breakfast and was now sitting there looking large and hairy. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Vextar's stress cracks spread visibly. Zip's defensive systems went into full alert. Thorn's spikes extended so far they actually whistled. And Bloopy began making a sound that could only be described as the gelatinous equivalent of a tea kettle having a nervous breakdown. "Oh, come on," Marcus said, reaching over to gently encourage the spider to relocate to a nearby rock. "It's just a huntsman. They're completely harmless." "Harmless?" Vextar's voice had reached a frequency that was probably causing distress calls on several nearby planets. "That creature is the size of your hand. It has 8 legs. It has multiple eyes." Marcus looked at the spider, which had settled onto its new rock and was now grooming its legs with casual personal hygiene that suggested it had absolutely no interest in killing anyone. "Well," he said carefully, "huntsmen aren't actually venomous. They're just big, and they mostly eat bugs and small lizards. Really, they're more afraid of you than you are of them." This was met with hysterical laughter from Bloopy. "More afraid of us? Marcus, I am currently having what I believe is a panic attack, and that spider is just sitting there looking smug." By noon, Marcus had officially become the most popular human in the history of interspecies education, entirely due to his ability to keep his classmates from dying of completely preventable causes. He'd shown Vexter how to construct a simple reflective shelter that allowed her crystalline structure to regulate temperature more effectively. He'd introduced Bloopy to morning dew collection, watching the gelatin spend the early hours essentially giving the landscape a very gentle, grateful hug. And he'd demonstrated to Zip that mechanical systems like his grandfather's old compass were more robust than sophisticated electronics in hostile environments. Seconds later, to Zip's intercom called at a nearby, and Bloopy quickly became interested. But the real turning point came when they encountered what Marcus privately thought of as the most Australian thing possible, a mob of kangaroos blocking their path to the next water source. The aliens took one look at the collection of large, muscular animals and immediately began discussing retreat strategy. "They're clearly aggressive," Thorn announced. "Look at their posture. Those powerful legs are designed for combat." Marcus watched the kangaroos, who were doing absolutely nothing more threatening than grazing and occasionally scratching themselves. "They're not aggressive. They're just kangaroos. They're basically giant rabbits with attitude problems." "Giant rabbits?" Bloopy squeaked. "Those creatures are nearly 2 meters tall. They have claws. They have muscles." "They're herbivores," Marcus said patiently. "They eat grass. They're only dangerous if you corner them or threaten their young, which we're not going to do because we're going to walk around them like sensible people." And that's exactly what they did. Marcus led his increasingly bewildered classmates in a wide arc around the kangaroo mob, maintaining a respectful distance. The kangaroos watched them pass with mild interest that suggested they found the aliens mildly amusing but not particularly threatening. "This is impossible," Vexstar muttered as they reached the water source. "Those creatures should have attacked us. We were clearly in their territory." "Potential threats to who?" Marcus asked, settling down in the shade. "We're a bunch of tired, dusty travelers looking for water. We're not competing for resources, we're not threatening their young, and we're obviously not interested in a fight. Why would they waste energy attacking us?" Professor Krang's voice crackled through their communicators. "Fascinating. Mr. Webb, your approach to interspecies conflict resolution is quite remarkable. You seem to have an intuitive understanding of predator-prey dynamics that your classmates, despite their advanced training, appear to lack." Marcus looked around at his classmates, who were now staring at him with expressions ranging from newfound respect to something approaching awe. "It's not really that complicated," he said, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "Most animals don't want to fight unless they have to. Fighting is dangerous and uses a lot of energy. If you're not threatening them and you're not competing with them for resources, they'll usually just ignore you." "Most animals," Zip repeated slowly. "Marcus, exactly how many different species have you had these kinds of encounters with?" Marcus considered the question while watching a small lizard sun itself on a nearby rock. "I don't know, most of them, I guess. I mean, I grew up camping and hiking. You learn to read animal behavior pretty quickly when you're sharing their space." "Mr. Webb," Vexstar said finally, "I believe I may have been operating under some incorrect assumptions about human capabilities." "We all have," Thorne added. "Marcus, when I first met you, I assumed that humans were a prey species. I now realize that assessment may have been incomplete." As the afternoon wore on and they made their way toward their final campsite, Marcus found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the group's acknowledged leader. His classmates looked to him for guidance on everything from route selection to resource management to wildlife assessment. And for the first time since he'd arrived at Zenith Galactic Academy, Marcus felt like he actually belonged. The revelation. The rescue transport arrived exactly 48 hours after they'd landed, its sleek hull gleaming against the red dirt like a chrome monument to galactic civilization. Professor Krang emerged, wearing barely contained academic excitement. What he found was not quite what anyone had expected. Vexstar stood near their organized campsite, her crystalline structure completely restored and somehow looking more resilient than before. Bloopy had achieved peak hydration, his blue coloration deeper and more vibrant than Marcus had ever seen it. Zip had undergone a philosophical transformation, his expensive electronics lying in a neat pile while he studied Marcus's grandfather's compass with religious reverence. Thorne looked like he'd just completed the most relaxing spa weekend of his life. And Marcus looked like he'd just finished a pleasant weekend at summer camp. "Remarkable," Professor Krang muttered. "Mr. Webb, I trust the examination was not too strenuous." Marcus shrugged, kicking dirt over the remains of their campfire. "Not really. Pretty standard camping conditions, actually. Good weather, decent water access, no major predator activity. Could have been a lot worse." The professor's tentacles went completely still. "No major predator activity? Mr. Webb, my monitoring equipment recorded encounters with at least 6 different species of local fauna, including several that the Galactic Wildlife Database classifies as potentially lethal." "Oh, you mean the dingo and the eagle and stuff?" Marcus shouldered his pack. "Yeah, we saw some animals. Mostly they just minded their own business." "Marcus," Bloopy said, his voice carrying hysteria, "you convinced an apex predator to take a nap 20 meters from our campsite. You had a conversation with a bird of prey. You led us past a mob of 2-meter-tall combat herbivores like you were taking a stroll through a botanical garden." "Combat herbivores?" Marcus looked back with genuine confusion. "Bloopy, they were kangaroos. They eat grass." Professor Krang was frantically taking notes. "Mr. Webb, for the purposes of my research, could you elaborate on your species' approach to interspecies conflict resolution?" Marcus climbed the transport ramp and settled into his seat. "I don't know if I'd call it conflict resolution. It's more like just not being stupid around animals. Most creatures don't want to fight unless they have to. If you're not threatening them and you're not competing with them for resources, they'll usually just ignore you." "Just ignore you," Vexstar repeated slowly. "Marcus, you're describing a level of environmental integration that most species require millions of years of coevolution to achieve." Marcus looked out the viewport as they lifted off. "We didn't develop them. We had to learn them. Earth is, well, it's kind of a rough neighborhood, biologically speaking. If you can't figure out how to coexist with the local wildlife, you don't survive long enough to reproduce." When you say Earth is a rough neighborhood, exactly how rough are we talking about? The professor asked. Marcus considered while watching the landscape disappear. Well, let's see. We've got deserts that can kill you in a day, forests that can kill you in an hour, oceans that can kill you in minutes, and weather patterns that can kill you pretty much instantly. Plus about 1 million different species that consider humans either food, competition, or a minor annoyance to be eliminated. He paused, noticing their expressions. But it's not that bad, really. You just have to pay attention and use common sense. Marcus, Bloopy said carefully, are you telling me that humans evolved on a planet where deadly encounters with hostile wildlife are considered normal daily occurrences? I wouldn't say normal. Most people go their whole lives without being eaten by anything. It's just that you have to know how to avoid the things that might want to eat you, or sting you, or trample you, or poison you. He trailed off as he realized his classmates were staring at him with horror and awe. Professor Krang was practically bouncing with excitement. This is extraordinary. We've been operating under the assumption that humans are a relatively peaceful species that developed intelligence as an alternative to physical adaptation. But what if we've got it backwards? Professor, are you suggesting that humans are actually an apex predator species? Vextar asked. Not exactly. I'm suggesting something far more interesting. What if humans are an apex survivor species? What if they evolved not to dominate their environment, but to integrate with it, so completely that they became effectively undetectable to other predators? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I don't know about apex anything. We're just good at not dying, I guess. Just good at not dying? Thorne repeated. Marcus, you kept 4 different species alive for 2 days in an environment that destroyed millions of credits worth of advanced survival equipment, using nothing but sticks and rocks and knowledge that your species considers basic childhood education. As they approached the academy, Marcus felt anxiety about returning to his role as the unremarkable human student. But something had changed. His classmates were looking at him differently now, not with polite condescension, but with respect. Marcus, Vextar said as they prepared to disembark, when you first arrived at the academy, I assumed you were here as some kind of diversity initiative, a way to demonstrate commitment to including less advanced species. Marcus winced. That's actually pretty close to what I thought too. But I was wrong. You're not here because they lowered the standards for humans. You're here because human standards are so much higher than ours that we didn't even recognize them as standards at all. As they walked through the academy's corridors, Marcus noticed that something fundamental had shifted. His classmates were asking his opinion on everything, wanting to know about human educational methods, problem-solving techniques, approaches to risk assessment. Marcus, Bloopy said as they reached the dormitory junction. There's an advanced survival studies program being offered next semester. I was wondering if you might be interested in forming a study group. Zip focused on Marcus intently. I'd like to learn more about low-technology solutions to complex problems. Do you think you could teach me some of the techniques your grandfather used? Thorne nodded, his spikes retracting in a sign of trust and respect. I would be honored to learn from you, Marcus. Marcus looked around at his classmates, his friends, and felt something warm spreading through his chest. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt like he actually had something valuable to contribute. Sure, he said, trying to keep his voice casual despite the grin threatening to take over his face. I'd be happy to show you guys some basic outdoor skills. Fair warning, though, it might involve getting dirty, eating things that taste like cardboard, and sleeping on the ground. After spending 2 days watching you make it look easy, Bloopy said with a gelatinous chuckle, I think we can handle a little discomfort. As Marcus made his way to his room, he reflected on the past few days. He'd come to the academy feeling like the least impressive student in the history of interspecies education. But somewhere between building fires with sticks and negotiating with kangaroos, he'd discovered something about himself. Humans weren't the weakest species in the galaxy. They weren't the most primitive, or the most fragile, or the most in need of protection. They were the survivors, the adapters, the species that had looked at a planet trying to kill them in 1,000 different ways and had decided to make friends with it instead. He pulled out his datapad and found a message waiting from the Academy's Advanced Studies Department. The subject line read, Invitation to Guest Lecture, Introduction to Deathworld Survival Techniques. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, then started laughing. The quiet kid from the back of the classroom was apparently about to become a professor. Earth biology, he thought with a grin, had always been full of surprises.